My name is Janet Dickerson, and on behalf of Media 2070, I want to welcome and thank you for joining us for today's media briefing, Newsrooms and Black Truths, 100 Years After the Tulsa Massacre. First, if you're just learning about us, I want to tell you a little bit about Media 2070, and you'll learn more as we get through the program. Media 2070 is an emerging Black-led, multiracial consortium of journalists, activists, scholars, and others who are calling on media organizations, regulators, and policymakers to make reparations for harms that historically up to present day have been inflicted on Black people by white-led media institutions. And Media 2070, in addition to being a consortium, is also a living archive of these harms, which we invite you, if you haven't already done so, to read in our essay, which is very expansive, very enlightening. You can find that at mediareparations.org. And again, you'll learn more about us throughout the program, which I'm very excited for us to get into. But before we do, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We're going to open up the program with some remarks from members of the Media 2070 team, along with our special guest speakers who are based in Tulsa. During this time, you're encouraged, as you're listening to the discussion, to drop any questions into the Q&A box that's down in the far right. And after we've completed the remarks from our speakers, we're going to pivot to a Q&A session where we'll start off with the questions that have already been submitted, and then time permitting, if we have space for more, you're welcome to keep dropping them in the box. A recording of today's briefing for those of you who may not be able to stay for the full time or want to be able to refer back to the conversation. We will be making that available afterwards, in addition to the presentation slides you're about to see. And again, we just really want to thank you for taking time to commemorate this pivotal moment in history with us. And so without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Colette Watson, who is a co-founder of Media 2070, as well as Vice President of Cultural Strategy at Free Press.
So today we'll discuss again the role of media and media anti-Blackness in suppressing and even sparking the Tulsa Massacre 100 years ago this week. In terms of an agenda, my colleague Janet has shared with you, you'll be hearing from the Media 2070 team, as well as local Black media leaders based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from the Tulsa Star, as well as the Black Wall Street Times. After our presentation, we'll have about 25 minutes for questions and answers. You can raise your hands virtually and our moderator will unmute each speaker. I'm Colette Watson. My pronouns are she and her. I'm Vice President of Cultural Strategy at Free Press. Spelling of my name is on the screen. And I'll be joined in this portion of the presentation by my colleague, Joseph Torres, co-creator of Media 2070, the best-selling author of News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media. So last year, Media 2070 launched with an essay around the roots of media harm. When we talk about media harm, again, we're exploring how dominant media structure has been complicit with and has been a site of anti-Black harms. But what does that mean? Anti-Blackness is in the DNA of our media system. And that means that from the very beginning, anti-Blackness was a feature of the media system's ability to be viable and the way that it connected with communities. In fact, revenue from so-called runaway slave ads helped the nation's earliest colonial newspapers stay afloat financially. So even as those papers circulated ideas of the American Revolution and other foundational aspects of early colonial society, those papers and the leaders of those papers were participating as brokers and gathering revenue from the trafficking of enslaved African persons in order to stay afloat. And so at Media 2070, we recognize that there are a few newspapers that still exist today that directly participated, but that our entire media system and the federal policies that shape it have been a site of harm for Black communities and communities of color. And so that is the basis upon which we're entering into our discussion of the Tulsa Massacre, particularly media complicity with how the tragedy began and its aftermath. So right now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Joe Torres, who will talk a little bit more about just what happened 100 years ago this week. Joe?
Thanks, Colette, and appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending this press conference, press briefing. I just want to say we're in the midst of a reckoning. It's also the anniversary of the public execution of George Floyd last year. And since then, there's been a media reckoning happening in our nation, including a reckoning what's going on in our nation's newsrooms as well. And like so many people, I knew a little bit about the story of Tulsa, but as people like myself and others continue to learn, and when we continue to grapple with the history about media institutions and their role in playing in violence against the Black community, central to the story of what happened in Tulsa is what the local newspapers did at the time. So with that, am I able to go to the next slide, Claire? So Tulsa had two daily newspapers, the Tulsa World, which still exists today, and the Tulsa Tribune, which went out of business in 1992. Richard Lloyd Jones was the purchased the Tribune in 1919, changed the name to the Tulsa Tribune. One author of the Tulsa Massacre labeled Lloyd Jones the most vocal racist in Tulsa. And he was the publisher and owner of the paper. Okay, next slide. So, like so many media institutions today, often Black folks are covered in the frame of a criminality, right? And the stories of what's happening to folks in everyday. In Black life and every day in the local communities is not covered. The same was true in Tulsa back then as well, especially how they covered Greenwood. But 10 days prior to the massacre, the Tulsa Tribune changed its coverage. It had a campaign against so-called lawlessness and bad policing to focus on criminality in Greenwood, and so it was very much. Anti-Black narratives that it was telling this story from. Okay, next. What is on May 31st, the newspaper famously, the Tulsa Tribune, reported that a 19-year-old young man named Dick Rawlins allegedly tried to rape a white teenage woman, which was he was exonerated. It was a false charge, but the Tulsa Tribune published this paper in this afternoon. It was an afternoon paper. This headline with a 5-paragraph story that was sensational details. Allegedly, as well, many survivors of the massacre and the race commission and the Tulsa Race Riot Commission also reported and a famous editorial that the publisher also published that afternoon that was predicting a lynching that night of Dick Rawlins. And remember, this is a time in our nation's history where lynching was a common a threat to Black life, right? And so this article combined with the editorial that many survivors said they read, but has not been located to this day because it was ripped out of the paper when it was archived, resulted in about 2,000 white folks going to the courthouse and demanding that the police turn over Dick Rawlins because they wanted to lynch him. And Black residents, including a lot of World War I veterans, grabbed their arms, went to the courthouse, and offered twice to the police to say to protect the lynching of Dick Rawlins. A scuffle ensued between when a white person tried to take away one of the guns from one of the Black Tulsa residents who was there to try to protect Dick Rawlins, and that was the beginning of the massacre that lasted for 18 hours. One of Delhi's riots, Delhi massacres, excuse me, About estimated 300 people have died. They're still looking for bodies to this day in mass graves that they believe exist still. The other presenters probably will talk about that as well. And you can next slide. And this is just, Tulsa is obviously it was coined named the Black Wall Street because it was thriving, right? It was a thriving community. Like in others, like in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 was a thriving Black city that the newspaper played a central role in its destruction, in the overthrow of the local government in 1898. In Tulsa, it was a thriving Black community that had so many institutions, including 2 Black newspapers, the Tulsa Star, published by A.J. Smitherman, and the Oklahoma Sun. They were also destroyed in the massacre. The papers afterwards, the editorials are horrific. This is the mayor, the police chief, like this is the quote from the mayor. I mean, so there was an effort after the massacre to blame this massacre on the Black community and the lawlessness in the Black community. And this is the mayor's framing, right, of what happened, right? He talked about that it was a Negro uprising. That's how they were framing it. And so there was concerns in the paper expressing that maybe not everyone has been captured, has been captured. And in addition, there's it was about 6,000 people who were put in detention camps. 10,000 people were left homeless. There was concerns that more folks had arms, and this was the framing at the time. And so the newspapers very much amplified it. Okay, next one. Yeah, so in this, so the Tulsa World, right, which is still in existence today, and I know a bunch of newspapers have in recent years acknowledged the history of harm. I'm not sure if Tulsa World has ever acknowledged. Maybe it has. I'm unaware of this fact, right? But they had an editorial that was labeled. The headline was called "Bad N-Word," right, and said that it was up to the Black community to control the bad folks in their community to prevent, in order to rebuild Tulsa, and the idea that do not waste the charity of basically white folks who are helping now to try to rebuild and try to help out, that it's not to waste that charity and basically follow different leaders. They're telling you have to follow different leaders because the leaders you have chosen have let you down, basically. Okay, next one. Yeah, the Tulsa Tribune was while the Tulsa World, it was used, of course, racist language and framing. The Tulsa Tribune by Lloyd Jones, which is much more on the nose about it. They did, they were like, do not even, this town, Greenwood, should never come back, do not rebuild it, and that that equality would never happen. Like the idea of this idea of equality, like it would never exist for Black folks, and that the white folks basically of Tulsa needs to rebuild and restore the honor and the shame in the name of Tulsa. And this was, he was advocating these editorials. And of course, like always, there was media resistance. Black folks in the community were telling their story of really what happened. And Mary E. Jones Parrish was an educator and a journalist, and she had, it's like in the tradition of like Ida B. Wells and others have come, like she fled for her life with her daughter from Greenwood, and she is had published, self-published her own account of what happened, but also interviewed survivors. And I believe this book is being republished and is coming out, I believe, next week, her book that came out right after the massacre. And our guest today can talk more about what what does media resistance look like today. But the Oklahoma Eagle was presses were salvaged from the destruction of the Tulsa Star, and they Don Ross, who is a legendary figure in Oklahoma politics and was a journalist, wrote about the massacre, editorialized about it in the 60s. The paper continued to publish editorials and so forth and so on since then. And yeah, and so there's always been folks telling what had truly, trying to tell the story of what truly has happened within the community. And I think that's it. Yeah. So the point is that the newspapers were the spark of it. And I got to say, I forgot to mention, really another critical part is the cover up. Obviously, a lot of people didn't know about Tulsa and still haven't, because it was a complete cover up from all the city officials, but the newspapers were complicit in the cover up. After the massacre happened, for decades, they wouldn't talk about it. According to one historian, the Tulsa World, it took to 1971 for the paper to even acknowledge the massacre in its paper. So literally the papers were complicit in the cover up. Anti-Black racism is not only the harm you do in the stories that you tell, it's also the stories that you choose not to tell. And they chose not to tell this massacre. And to this day, folks are still learning about what happened. And so this is part of Media 2070, which trying to continue to make sure these stories, because in places like Tulsa, Wilmington, North Carolina, and other places that they're still learning about, to make it known, particularly the role of the media system and media institutions play in anti-Black violence. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joe. Right now, I'm going to invite onto our virtual stage one of our guest speakers this afternoon, Tamantha Norman. Tamantha is a writer, editor, researcher, policy advocate, founder of the New Tulsa Star, and a North Tulsa native. She is interested in reclaiming the history of Black Wall Street, and we're grateful to have you with us today. Tamantha?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I want to make sure sound is good. Awesome. Well, I won't get into any more of the historical context that Joseph so lovely and explicitly went into. But for me, when we talk about how the media was complicit in stoking the racial tension and fires that led to the massacre, and then the initial cover-up afterwards, I've really been concerned about the media's role in presenting a false narrative or giving Tulsans a false collective memory that we have done the work that needs to be done in reconciliation as far as Black Tulsans related to this massacre, especially the last 5 to 7 years, as city officials, state officials have been aware that the national spotlight has been fast approaching onto Tulsa. There's been a lot of superficial gestures made, plaques put up. There's a history center being built right now that's not even finished, and the centennial is happening this weekend. But there's nothing that they have done, whether it's Tulsa World issuing an apology for the active role they played, city officials, nothing that they've done to really make true amends in a way that's going to extract power and influence from themselves. And what I mean by that is, admitting criminal fault, civil liability, all of those things are going to lead to those individuals truly facing themselves and the legacy of their ancestors and the hatred and despair that they visited upon my ancestors. And that cognitive dissonance is too much for a lot of folks to bear. And we've seen this all over the country, right? With George Floyd, I was just reading the other day on the anniversary of his public execution that a lot of white folks are not as interested in Black Lives Matter now that it's been a year past, and they're no longer interested in really putting forth their capital to helping Black lives. They were more interested in what can we do very quickly to get that immediate gratification that we're not terrible people. A lot of folks are not interested in doing the long-term work to really deconstruct themselves and decolonize themselves in the way that they show up in their own relationships and in the world. So how you do that in the media is that, a lot of the media is really focused on what you're taught in journalism school, right? Like, let's have the human interest pieces. let's put out the positive stories. And it's like, yeah, there's a time and place for that, but there was real harm and damage and ongoing historical trauma, economic disadvantages that are still perpetuating all up and through the community to this day that have not been addressed. I mean, you have some nonprofits contribute programming here and there, but there's nothing getting to the structural and systemic racism that led to the massacre, that allowed the conspiracy of silence to go on for all these decades, and then has continued to allow the city and state officials to drag their feet on really making amends to direct descendants and survivors and the North Tulsa community as a whole. And the media, unfortunately, you know, has been complicit, you know, all these decades in their silence. You know, we've had a commemoration for the massacre every year since this happened, obviously. So there's been a lot of opportunities for local mainstream publications to tell us the real story of the massacre, to interview these survivors long before the national media came and interviewed these survivors. So for me, it just kind of reeks as this thing of like, what can we do to get this guilt and shame off of us without really digging into why the guilt and shame is there to begin with, and doing that hard, arduous work to do that, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Tamantha. Absolutely, that makes sense. And we appreciate you sharing the truth of what is happening in Tulsa and has been continuing to happen. Tamantha, thank you for being with us today. And hopefully folks are able to check out the PDF that we will be sending around after this briefing. It will include contact information to reach Tamantha Norman at the Tulsa Star, as well as correct spellings of names, and more information on how to follow and stay in touch. I'd like to now invite to the virtual stage Dionne Osborne, who is an associate editor for the Black Wall Street Times. Dionne has also written for OU's student newspaper, the OU Daily, as well as Oklahoma City-based Red Dirt Report. And he's also a former intern at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Dionne, we're very grateful to have you here today.
I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, just to be in the same space as folks like Tamantha, you know, with the Tulsa Star and what she's done to bring that back. You know, I'm just honored to be able to share just a little bit, you know, of a perspective with you all. I'm not a Tulsa native. Did not grow up in Tulsa. I did learn about the massacre as a kid at a church conference. My background is more of starting out in activism and kind of, you know, being around different events and, you know, different struggles with different groups, which led me to Tulsa, interning with OK Policy, and then working with Nehemiah Frank, the founder and editor-in-chief, who is a descendant of Tulsa race massacre survivors. And so for me, you know, Black media has always been the true representation of journalism, you know, because when you think about what journalism is supposed to be, it's supposed to be, you know, that fourth estate. It's supposed to be that check on injustice, on government overreach, and, you know, it's supposed to reveal the humanity of everyone's stories, right? And as you already explained in the presentation earlier, you know, traditional white media has always been traditionally used to uplift white supremacy and to maintain that status quo, you know. And so as we approach the centennial, it's really important for people to understand that there are two competing initiatives, which Tamantha pretty much already laid out. You know, you have the Centennial Commission, which is focused on, you know, presenting this political show of unity with History Center that the survivors and descendants did not even ask for. And to put that in perspective, I believe the New York Times recently released a report indicating that somewhere around $30 million in today's dollars is what Greenwood lost, at least. And the Centennial Commission has already raised more than that, 20 million of which went to the History Center. And the 3 living survivors, who are 107, 106, and 100, have yet to see a dime of that money. And so when it comes to the commemoration, a lot of people looking at Tulsa might see it as a celebration, an opportunity for national recognition. But at the end of the day, the survivors and descendants want the focus to be on justice and restitution. And so here at the Black Wall Street Times, as someone who has, I consider myself kind of an outsider to the community, I see my role as one to uplift those stories, to uplift, those demands for justice, because, when we look at when we talk about journalism as supposedly being unbiased, it has never been unbiased. It's just a matter of what bias you lean on. And so I feel like our bias should be to, do what we can to restore, repair, and reform and reparate and push for that. And so that's what we try to do, here at the Times. You know, you talk about media justice and what that looks like, right? And, I feel like media justice looks like, uplifting Black platforms and offering opportunities to break down barriers to bringing in new journalists. For instance, it was a struggle for me, trying to navigate a career as a writer when a lot of, traditional or, local media would not, recognize you or recognize your potential as a person of color, as a Black person, and even when you do get into those positions, oftentimes the stories you want to tell and perspectives you want to reveal, get shut down or you have to fight, and so it ended up being a Black media company that gave me my first real opportunity as a full-time writer. And so that's why I say media justice looks like just give us the money and we'll do it on our own, because we know what we're doing. And, the rest of the world is playing catch up to us. One other thing I want to highlight is you talked about it a little bit already, how now that after the George Floyd police lynching, you have national, white-owned media, actually interviewing family members, actually looking into who this person was, instead of just showing the last moments of their life. And so when I was listening on NPR talking about the Black community has been forever changed, the world has been forever changed, it's white folks who've been forever changed. It's those white folks that have a conscience who something clicked, something so inhumane and destructive, to a human life was something they couldn't turn away from. And so that's what changed. And, we're having this reckoning, like you said, where they're looking at themselves and how they can undo the harms that they've caused, and so I say it's really important that we continue as Black media, unapologetically to tell our stories in our way. And I know that's kind of kind of threw a lot out there, but I just, I'm upset because, hearing these stories, and just the indifference, when you look at George Floyd and his murderer, the indifference in his eyes, it wasn't necessarily rage, but it was indifference to human life. And that's exactly what we've been dealing with, or I should say what Black Tulsans have been dealing with for the last 100 years. To have a mayor go on national television and say reparations is too divisive, it takes away the humanity, because I'll reiterate what a Chief Amusan said at the recent congressional subcommittee hearing on the Tulsa Race Massacre on May 19th, in which he asked, when people ask him, what does reparations look like, for Black people or for Black Tulsans in particular? The same as it looked like for the Jews, the same as it looked like for Japanese, and the same as it looked like for the Rosewood community. And so, it's about unapologetically, pushing our humanity and the humanity of these communities that has been for so long ignored.
Yes, thank you, Dionne, so much. And thank you for reminding us that this week does mark 1 year since the murder, the police lynching of George Floyd. And when we talk about these issues, I appreciate you in particular lifting up the systemic nature of the issue, because oftentimes people fail to realize that, as you said, while something may have clicked regarding the George Floyd murder, that there is a George Floyd and a Breonna Taylor and a Tony McDade almost every day in our communities. And so what we at Media 2070 are working to visibilize is the fact that these issues are not only happening when there's a viral video, that there's the Tulsa Massacre that occurred 100 years ago, and it's not the only massacre of a Black community, and that there are stories and realities that are suppressed every day across this country by virtue not only of the lack of telling of the stories, but also by virtue of the structure of the media system, which is shaped by federal policy. And so I'm going to invite my colleague, Alicia Bell, to talk a little bit more about what this media system's harms look like in the ways that it sets conditions for the lived realities of systemic oppression and the experiences of Black media makers like Dionne, like Tamantha, and so many others who are fighting to tell and visibilize truths.
Thank you so much, Colette. And I'm just so thankful to be here following up from Tamantha and Dionne's words. When we're thinking about this invisibilization and this lack of humanity that happens, we know that those are real lives, those are material conditions, those impact policy, they impact the policies that govern our lives, and all of that is created by public opinion and by public culture. And news, journalism, entertainment, all the pieces that play a role in this media constellation play a role in creating that public opinion and creating those material conditions. The way that we know that this is systemic, that this is not just about Tulsa, but also entirely about Tulsa, that this is not just about Wilmington, but entirely about Wilmington, that this is about the constellation of Blackness across the United States and globally as well, is because of a few things that I'll lift up right now. This report in 1969 from the United States Department of Justice Community Relations Service lifted up then that few American institutions have so completely excluded minority group members from influence and control as have the news media. And this was not just about narrative. It was not just about stories that were told or not told. It was also about ownership, management, and employment statistics. So we know this is a systemic issue and that it is happening currently. And it's something that has been happening for decades, for centuries. Just before that, the Kerner Commission, also known as the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, shared in their report that far too often the press acts and talks about Negroes as if Negroes do not read the newspapers or watch television, give birth, marry, die, and go to PTA meetings. So when Dionne's talking about the dehumanization or the invisibilization that happens of Black lives, when Tamantha's talking about the opportunities that there have been, but that have not been made, we knew this 50 years ago, and we continue to know it now. Today, deregulation has resulted in few Black media owners. Less than 1% of full power TV stations are Black owned and controlled. We also know that out of 11,000 commercial AM FM radio stations, only 217 of them are owned by Black folks in 2017, which is where we have the most recent data. We also know that in 2017, when Color of Change conducted a study in partnership with the Family Story Project, they found that Black families represented 59% of stories about poverty in news and opinion outlets like CNN and Fox News, even though we make up just 27% of poor families in the country. Similarly, Color of Change and Media Matters partnered in 2015, finding that 51% of NYPD arrests for murder, assault, and theft were Black folks, but 75% of the people presented as perpetrators of crime by local media were Black. So there was an exaggeration by at least 24%. And for one newsroom in particular, it was 82%, which created about a 31% difference in the coverage and presentation of perpetration of crime versus the reality. So what we know is that these public narratives that are being created are also not true. In 2017, which is the last recent data we have from the ASNI Diversity Survey, Black journalists remain underrepresented in our nation's newsrooms, making up just 5.6% of all newsroom staffers working at daily publications and online sites, and 4.6% of newsroom leaders. This is 50 years after the recommendations from the Kerner Commission that I mentioned earlier, and even in 100 years from commissions in Chicago that lifted up the same thing. And so the work that we're doing with Media 2070 is a campaign for media reparations, because this can't continue and we can't stay on this hamster wheel for the next 50 years. We need change and we need repair, we need reconciliation, we need transformation and alchemy now. So Media 2070 is an emergent consortium and campaign that Janet talked about earlier. We're advocating for reparations to the Black community for harms that media and tech companies have inflicted on Black lives throughout US history and continue to inflict today. Today, we have a de facto media apartheid system where the vast majority of radio, TV, cable, and broadband networks are white-owned and controlled companies. And if we're gonna be a multiracial democracy, if we're gonna be one that's oriented towards a plurality of people, we have to transform the system. Otherwise, we'll never have that. So the work we've done last year is we released this essay that Colette mentioned earlier. This year, we're doing a lot of organizing, hosting dream salons and visioning convenings to figure out what are the visions that folks know are possible by 2070 and beyond. We're coaching newsrooms on how to get there. We're building power and building support and capacity with Black-led newsrooms, with organizers, activists, media makers, folks across the journalism industry, as well as other kinds of media industries, such as theater, entertainment, et cetera. And beyond this, we will co-create and win a cultural, organizational, philanthropic, and governmental reparations platform. And on the other side of reparations, because we know that reparations is both a destination and a process, we know that our dreams and our visions exist on the other side. And on the other side of reparations is support, capacity building, and co-creating whatever is there. Whatever the constellation of media and journalism and news that we need to exist will be, that's what we're going to do. We'll know we're winning when Black folks have the social and financial capital necessary to tell our stories, from ideation through creation, distribution, and that this facilitates parallel truths in other Indigenous communities and in all communities of color. When community members are engaging in transforming media systems and infrastructure towards becoming reparative and community owned, when there's an abundance of media that showcases the possibilities and existence of repair and reconciliation, we'll know that we're winning media reparations. So as we begin to dream towards media reparations, we call on all media organizations, those of you who are here now, those of you who are watching in the future, to expand beyond diversity and inclusion conversations into actions that shift power and resources to those of us who are parts of communities that have been historically harmed, and to our whole communities as well. We're calling on the federal government to make this investment of time and resources necessary to do a thorough investigation of how media-related policies have impacted Black and POC communities, because we know as much as this is institutional, it's also systemic, it's governmental, and there's change that needs to happen at the policy level as well. With that, I will pass it back to Colette to wrap us up.
And yeah, and keep sharing your screen, Alicia. Thank you so much for that. As was mentioned earlier, massacre survivor Viola Ford Fletcher journeyed to Washington, D.C. for the first time in her life during a global pandemic to testify as to the events of 1921. And she said, "We lost everything that day: our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented the best of what was possible for Black people in America and for all people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For Black Americans, for white Americans, for all Americans, that's some justice." And as we move to close, I'll share a quote from our director of Media 2070, Alicia Bell. as we dream the future, may there be no more journalism written with the blood of Black lives. At this time, with appreciation for your attention, I'll turn it over to Janet to moderate our Q&A. Janet?
Thank you, Colette. And wow, I mean, I'm just really mind blown by the conversation today, and just want to reiterate thanks for everybody, especially Tamantha and Dionne for joining. Folks are invited to drop any questions into the chat. Currently, there aren't any questions, so maybe I'll kick things off with my own, and that'll give folks time to drop theirs in the Q&A box. And this is a question that's open to anybody who wants to respond, but what's very clear is that what mainstream media institutions sought to suppress about the massacre story, pop culture stepped in and sort of opened up people's awareness. And so in some ways, right, we saw with The Watchmen, we saw with Lovecraft Country, and I'm speaking more on just sort of like a national or international level, like bringing, as you said, Dionne, and I wrote this down, it's white folks who have been forever changed, right? But among Black communities, we've known about these stories. So what role does storytelling play in bringing suppressed stories to the fore, and how important do you think storytelling is to media reparations as a whole?
Okay, I wanted to give Tamantha a chance to speak first, but okay.
Tamantha, I think you're still muted,
Oh,
so we can't hear you. We can see you speaking, but we can't hear you now.
Okay, there you go. I had to wait for the moderator to unmute me. There we go. So I would say, to me, while, you know, I do agree with Dionne that it's really the white community that needs to come to terms with what happened, I do think, there's drawbacks and there's, advantages to popular culture kind of latching onto this story. It kind of brings it back to the forefront, even for Black Tulsans, because to be honest, other than having, for me personally, speaking about my own personal experience, other than having a mother who was interested in genealogy and interested in the massacre and who knew a survivor of the massacre who told stories about it, no one else in my immediate family talked about it. I had a great grandfather who was alive during the time. He didn't speak about it because the culture of silence, the culture of intimidation and fear that Black Tulsans were passed down for generations after the massacre was very real. That historical trauma still exists today, even with folks in local activist circles doing what they can to make demands and stuff. But I do feel like that fear is in the back of everybody's mind that the city did something that catastrophic to the Black community for just existing and being free in and of themselves. What would they do to us for bucking the system? You know what I mean? So I do feel like that is a real subconscious fear for a lot of Black folks in Tulsa, honestly. And I do feel like pop culture kind of bringing that to the forefront kind of in a weird way gave Black Tulsans like the go ahead to really start to talk about that and own that history and not be ashamed of that history, because there's nothing to be ashamed of. You know, we weren't the perpetrators of that savagery. We were the victims of it. And not only that, the community built bigger and better in the 50s and 60s and was destroyed again through urban renewal and a lot of other things, which that's a whole nother conversation that needs to be had, and reparations that needs to be made for the second destruction of Greenwood and Black Wall Street, honestly. But, you know, I think it was helpful to have shows like The Watchmen come out and kind of spread the national consciousness around that and kind of light a fire under the behinds of certain state and local entities. But one of the drawbacks is obviously it's pop culture. They're going to pick the most salacious parts of that history. Some of it might be factual, some of it might not be. So again, while these entertainment entities are doing us a service by exposing what happened, they still, just like city and state officials need to do, they need to be letting descendants and survivors and local activists and advocates who know the history, who have been living this for decades, that have been trying to make this narrative public for decades, they need to be leading the charge so that this information is factual at all times. I mean, it's really important. You know, we've seen what happened in the last presidential administration when people decide to make up their own facts, to create their own realities, and the damage that can have. So, you know, just like with the massacre, it's really important to have those impacted lead those efforts.
Thank you, Tamantha. And Dionne, I know you wanted to get in there. And then we do have a question, or I thought you wanted to get in there, not to call you out. And then we do have a question in the chat. Did anyone else want to take this before we go to Barrington's question?
I think Tamantha pretty much covered that.
Thank you, Tamantha.
Janet, I will just tag in to say really quickly that I think also what Tamantha brings up underscores the importance of news media reckoning with these histories, even as we are, you know, glad to see entertainment media storytelling. As Tamantha mentioned, there is going to be a different element oftentimes in the ways that stories are told in the entertainment sector. And it just underscores for me the importance of news and journalism media being just in the stories that are chosen and the ways that those stories are told.
Thanks, Colette. So we're going to go to a question from Barrington Salmon, who is a freelance journalist who's written with NBC News, Atlanta Black Star, and several others. So Barrington starts off with a comment, which I think is I'll turn into a question. How can he and other folks get involved with Media 2070? And then also he asks, how do we bring all these great minds and experiences to build our own media empires and entities?
I'll quickly say, in terms of getting involved, that a great place to start is our website, Media 2070. That's media2070.org. And there you can actually sign up to join our consortium. And also to stay informed, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Media 2070. But I'll let my colleagues talk a little bit more about that and bringing folks and building our own empires and entities.
Yeah, and just before kind of getting into that, we'll also share that if folks are feeling like they want to take action of some sort, or are connected to journalists or newsrooms who want to make a commitment to caring for Black communities, we have a pledge right now that newsrooms can take. And you can find that at bit.ly/trustblackjournalist. That's like with a capital T, a capital B, and a capital J. That's bit.ly/trustblackjournalist. And newsrooms anywhere can sign on to that pledge to make a pledge to continue caring, to maintain care, or to increase how they are caring for Black communities.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Chris Jones. Thank you, Chris. It's a little long, so I'm trying to get to the question part. But really, he says, I'm a journalist for 100 Days in Appalachia in West Virginia, where we're also looking into a 100-year anniversary of violence against a Black community there. The estimated 2,000 Black coal miners who took part in the fight for organized labor that culminated in the 1921 Battle of Blair Mountain in southern West Virginia. So Chris's question is, what resources would you suggest that he can provide to ensure that these personal archives are handled correctly and equitably and inform future reporting? Because that's something that they're trying to do there, is make sure that they are archiving these stories. And obviously that's something that Media 2070 is doing on a large scale. So what are some resources that he can be pointed to share with colleagues?
If he's talking about like physically archiving like the stories that have been collecting, I think he said like this, folks have recorded this or wrote about it or have journaled. I'm trying to read it. It's like, I'd love to talk, we can talk to Chris offline if that's possible to think about, because that's one thing about like is that often our work is not archived, it's not saved, so it could be found, one of the stories in reading and studying the Tulsa Massacre is the John Hope Franklin's father, who was a prominent lawyer. He wrote he wrote like he wrote like a 10-page. Um, he, uh, he wrote about what happened, and it was found like in 2015, I believe, a detailed of what happened in Tulsa, because he lived through it, right? And is a survivor, and it's now the Smithsonian, but I am sure there's a lot of folks who have these histories, right? And they need, and we need to save that history, right? And so it's like and how to preserve it so it could be, the story can continue to be told and have a chance to continue to be told, and that's what we're hoping when we write stories, right? That they can that they will live on, right? That the next generation, it was not forgotten, right? And so, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joe. If no one else wants to take that on, we now have another question. Tamantha, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, and John Hope Franklin was an important historical figure as well, but I'm thinking that letter he's speaking to is B.C. Franklin, Buck Colbert Franklin, which was an attorney that helped with rebuilding the community, providing legal services to the community after the massacre.
That was his father, right? John Hope Franklin's father?
No, they're two different.
Oh, two different. I'm sorry, my bad. Apologies.
That's okay.
I'll just tag in on Chris's question and say that, I know there's not an HBCU in West Virginia, but sometimes HBCU journalism or historical departments can be a help with digitizing personal archives and making sure that they're protected. And then sometimes, not all the time, local public libraries can also be helpful with that, with those kinds of services. But as Joe said, definitely connect with us offline, and we would be happy to talk about it further and try to help support you in those. I think that there probably are some nonprofit newsrooms that might also be some of the larger ones that might be helpful in thinking through that process.
Great. And I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions, but here we have one from Philip Lewis, who is a journalist at the Huffington Post. He says, you talked a little bit about this earlier regarding Tulsa World, but I'm curious what we think newsrooms should do to reconcile with their racist past. For example, the Kansas City Star had a project where they apologized for decades of racist reporting and hired an editor to focus on race. What more should be done? Thanks, Philip.
I can definitely try to take a stab at this one. Just as an example, the Tulsa World was referring to the massacre as a riot up until just a few years ago. And the reason it changed wasn't because they had a change of heart, but rather because, folks in the community continued to push them, and so one of the changes they made, at the request of Nehemiah Frank, who's our editor-in-chief, was to add a Black journalist to their editorial team. It was an all-white editorial board, and when we think about, these decisions, and you're deciding how to refer to this massacre, and you have no, Black Americans in the room, that right there is crucial, and so just having decision makers in the room, and having Black journalists who don't focus just on race, having Black journalists who focus on politics in general, on health in general, who are able to highlight the racial disparities within those sectors. But when you just limit journalists to just covering social, the social justice or the race, or the crime beat, you're really limiting what they can do with other beats. And so I think, expanding and seeing how you can mold covering racial disparities within all aspects of your news gathering.
Can I also add something to that? I also think, like, as we mentioned too, that there's as Alicia said, we need to fund Black media, You know what I'm saying? And it's like, if these institutions, there's this debate right now happening. There's growing support in Congress, for example, for legislation for the federal government to intervene to save local journalism, local journalism institutions, right? So if you have an institution that's been harming the Black community for all these years, and the federal government is intervening, can the federal government intervene financially? And because the federal government always is critically responsible for creating the conditions of the media and the media system and how it operates. If the federal government is going to intervene, can we, like Alicia said, fund an abundance of Black media platforms and Black owners who control and create and control the distribution of their own narratives, instead of continue to prop up institutions that not only failing, some of these institutions are not owned by hedge funds and stuff like that, right? But also that's failing the community, but it's historically harmed the community, and it's invest that money into Black-owned platforms. And so that is a live debate actually happening in Congress, and so that's where we need to think about the structural as well.
And that's a great segue to the final question, because we're almost at time. But Joe, you were just talking about the role of government. And so this next question, and forgive me, I'm going to try really hard to pronounce your name correctly, Chinwe Onyekari, from the Health Spark Foundation asks, how can philanthropy engage with Media 2070 and leverage investments and endowment to support narrative change, storytelling, and Black media ownership, which we were just talking about?
Yeah, we're looking to work with folks in philanthropy who want to transform the philanthropic landscape. So we're thinking about the creation of a working group with folks who are in that funding and philanthropic space, because what we know is that we need shifts to the culture of philanthropy that makes it more reparative, that makes it more rooted in Black communities. We also need shifts in funding strategies to make sure that not only are Black media makers and journalists funded more, to the points that were raised earlier, but also that organizations who are doing work of getting information to our communities, Black-led organizations that are lifting up the stories and the narratives of our communities, are also being funded. Sometimes they look like maternal health organizations or education justice organizations, or organizations that are working with formerly incarcerated folks, but many times those organizations play important roles in getting information to our folks. And so we need that shift, and we need philanthropy that has strategies that are going to fund Black leaders, Black-led organizations, and Black serving organizations, and in a way that has been disproportionate to the history of philanthropy. And we also need folks working in philanthropy to be participating in some of this work to shift the federal landscape of funding, so that it's not just on private philanthropy or even public philanthropy, but that it's baked into our system into the future, that we have a thriving ecosystem where Black stories, Black narrative, and Black news is abundant and representative of all the Black genius and resilience and strength and creativity that exist in this country and around the world.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And so on that note, that is going to wrap up the Q&A portion. Thank you for everyone who contributed questions. We're going to keep those. There are a couple more we weren't able to get to, but we definitely want to be in touch. I will turn it back over to Colette to close us off.
Thank you so much, Janet. Much appreciation to you for the excellent moderation. Thank you, Tamantha and Dionne, for joining us from Tulsa. We are just, again, very appreciative of the ability to have an authentic view into what is happening there in Tulsa, and also the work that you're doing to as truth tellers, as journalists and media makers. So can't thank you enough for that. Appreciation to my colleagues, Alicia Bell and Joe Torres, and also to all of the attendees here today. We hope that you'll keep in touch with us Again, we'll be sending around a PDF of the presentation that will include contact information, but you can visit media2070.org. And I'd also like to announce that Joe Torres has published an essay just a little bit ago today, which really unpacks the role of media in the Tulsa Massacre and its aftermath. And you can actually access that at freepress.net/Tulsa Massacre. That's freepress.net/Tulsa Massacre. And that is an essay just released here today. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today and joining us. And if you would like to have a deeper dive conversation, we are available for interviews. You can reach out to Janet Dickerson to be in touch with us. And Janet's phone number, which I thought I had committed to memory, but is failing me right now, is 917-653-4368. Is that right, Janet? All right, 917-653-4368 is how you can reach Janet to schedule any interviews or follow-up conversations with our team, and also to be able to make contact with the Black Wall Street Times and the Tulsa Star. Thank you for tuning in, and we will look forward to continuing conversations with you as we build a world where reparations are real.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.